Ready? I'd like to call this council and committee meeting to order. Madam Clerk, the roll call, please.
All members of council are present, Your Worship.
Thank you. No addendums. One announcement, the snowbirds are in Fort Erie on Wednesday, September the 19th. They're going to be flying at 4:30. The best place to see them will be at the bottom of Beatrice Street along the river, but they fly high, they fly fast. You'll be able to see them wherever you are in Fort Erie. So that's the snowbirds. They were to have come last year. There was a cancellation, but they will be back Wednesday. Are there any disclosures of pecuniary interest? Madam Clerk, I have one with respect to report CAO 11-18 with respect to the Crystal Ridge Community Center, since I'm a member of the Ridgeway Lions Club, which is involved in the Crystal Ridge Community Center operation. There are no notices of upcoming public meetings. There is a public meeting this evening with respect to a town-initiated housekeeping amendment to our comprehensive zoning bylaw. Mr. Kernahan, if you'd like to come forward. We will hear from Mr. Kernahan, member of staff, providing us with some background information. Then I will ask if there's anyone who wishes to speak to the proposed amendments, either for or against. Please proceed.
Other means in order to satisfy the direction of council for providing notice of housekeeping amendments. These other means included posting on the town's website, posting on social media. Notice of the public meeting was sent to the business improvement associations. Notice of the amendments were advertised on the billboard at the corner of Municipal Center Drive and Garrison Road. And notice of the amendments was posted at library branches, the Leisureplex Museum, and in the Town Hall atrium. In addition to these, notice of the public meeting and the neighborhood information meeting were provided directly to the owners of 12 Lake Breeze Court, a property which is subject to a site-specific zoning change through this amendment. This slide summarizes the proposed changes to the general provisions section of the bylaw. Two sections of the bylaw are proposed to be deleted, namely the lanes as yards provision, which counts a portion of a public lane as a yard, and the minor violations after 10 years provision, which permits minor violations that are brought to light through complaints or otherwise to remain if they've been there for 10 years or longer. Provision is proposed to be added to the accessible parking provisions to ensure that required accessible parking spaces are provided near entrances. Two changes are proposed to pool provisions. The first is a point of clarification to indicate that pool equipment only needs to be set back 3 meters from lot lines when it is not enclosed within a building and 1 meter when it is. The second change is to require a 0.5 meter setback from decks and patios associated with pools to lot lines in order to ensure that they don't result in drainage impacts. The change is proposed to permit decks and porches to encroach into the required setbacks in agricultural and rural zones. And there's also a stenographic change proposed to clarify the regulations in this section. Lastly, it's proposed that the requirements for outdoor patios associated with eating establishments be changed to remove the requirement for a 2 meter setback from lot lines. A change is proposed that affects the definition of lot and lot line in Section 5 and amends certain provisions in the RM1 zone to address setbacks from condominium unit lines. This slide demonstrates an example of a vacant land condominium townhouse development. There are 2 blocks of 3 townhouse units shown here on opposite sides of a private street labeled as Butternut Crescent. Lot lines are also shown in red and condominium unit lines are shown in green. Currently, the zoning bylaw treats condominium units the same as lots and measures setbacks and coverage according to condominium units lines. This proves problematic in that condominium units are very different from lots in that they are surrounded by private space, which is managed by a condominium corporation, rather than public space owned by the town, as is the case with lot lines. In many cases, as is shown here, the condominium unit stops many meters short of the private street or the extent of the rear or side yards. This is because in condominiums, there are common element areas in front, side, and rear yards which are managed by the corporation rather than the individual property owner. The proposed changes will align the zoning requirements with the intent of the bylaw for condominiums. Provisions will remain in place to ensure that there is a minimum of a 6 meter setback from garages to private streets and a minimum privacy area in the rear yards of condominium units. This slide summarizes the proposed changes to other sections of the bylaw. The regulations for residential apartments and commercial and core mixed-use zones is proposed to change to require a minimum of 10.5 square meters of open space when it is provided on a balcony. This provision is designed to make it more feasible to achieve the minimum open space requirement in the downtown cores. Changes are proposed in the urban entertainment zone, which includes the land surrounding the horse race track. Currently, any additions to existing uses or the addition of an accessory building, such as garages, necessitates a zoning bylaw amendment. The proposed changes would introduce regulations to permit existing uses to expand and to have accessory buildings. Changes proposed to the core mixed-use zone in Crystal Beach. The CMU2 zone in Crystal Beach permits single detached dwellings subject to the regulations of the R2 zone. These R2 zoning regulations permit single detached dwellings on relatively large lots with generous setbacks. However, residential lands within the neighborhood around the CMU2 zone have R2B zoning. This R2B zoning permits development of single detached dwellings on smaller lots that are characteristic of the subdivision fabric in this area with more liberal setbacks. The proposed change will permit single detached dwellings within the CMU2 zone subject to the R2B regulations. Changes are proposed to the core mixed-use zones for Ridgeway, Thunder Bay, and Spears High Point. Currently, these zones require a minimum of 50% of the floor area to be residential, but permit 3 stories. This means that it is not permissible to have the main floor commercial and 2 stories of residential above. The proposed change will permit this scenario, but will not impact the requirement for commercial on the main floor. A change is also proposed to permit accessory residential uses in institutional zones subject to the appropriate residential zoning regulations. Lastly, the lot at 12 Lake Breeze Court is proposed to change from a site-specific residential 2A zone to an open space zone. The purpose of this change is to ensure it remains in its open space use. The property was bought by a group of residents living near it recently, and they collectively requested that the town undertake the proposed change to ensure that it cannot be built on. This slide shows the timeline of the housekeeping amendment following the initiation on August 13th through to the public meeting this evening. The next step in this process will be to incorporate public input, if any is received. Following the incorporation of input received, a recommendation report is planned to be brought forward to council on October 1st. A bylaw will then be passed subject to council approval, and the amendments would come into effect in early November. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kernahan. Any members of council have any questions? Councilor Knapp.
Thank you, Your Worship. Through to you to Mr. Kernahan. Item 6.44, minor yard variations after 10 years. You're taking out the grandfathering in. So do you have a record of all the people that have been grandfathered in thus far, where they've been able to prove that their building's been there or whatever for more than 10 years?
No, we do not.
So if someone complains after this is passed and it doesn't meet the new standards, but it met the standards at the time that it was built, what's going to happen to those people?
This doesn't change someone's ability to be to prove as legal non-conforming if they're able to do that. What this does is it removes someone's ability to continue to not comply with the bylaw just by virtue of being there for 10 years or more. So it wouldn't, if they can prove that, let's for instance say that the regulation which they're not complying with came into effect in 1990, if they can prove that they've existed since prior to 1990, then they can be grandfathered in. What it doesn't do is just allow them to be grandfathered in if they've only existed there for 10 years.
Okay, thank you.
Anyone else? Councillor McDermott.
Yes, thank you, Your Worship. The same slide, lane as yards. I know I have a couple of laneways, maybe 4 or 5 laneways in the north end. How will that, are people actually building on the laneways? Is that what you're saying?
The intent of this provision is, I suspect the laneways you're talking about are behind Jarvis Street. So the intent of this provision is when somebody has a laneway in their rear yard, let's say, and there's a requirement for a 10-meter setback to that rear yard, half of that laneway can count as part of that 10 meters. In the case of Jarvis Street, there is no requirement for a rear yard. It's zero. So this provision would typically not apply in the north end.
If I may continue, Your Worship. So then I take it then that those laneways are, they have really, there's nobody there that's not in compliance right now?
I couldn't verify if there's anybody that isn't in compliance. All I can say is that typically lands along Jarvis Street are zoned in a way that they don't have any requirement for a rear yard setback. The requirement is zero. So the ability to use part of that laneway as a portion of their required yard isn't really an issue because there is no required yard.
Thank you.
Any other councillors? Mr. Kernahan, just to go back to the point raised by Councillor Nutt. So do you have here what the provision actually is, the 6.44? It in essence says that if you have a minor violation of the zoning bylaw and you can prove that it's been in existence for 10 years or more, what? The municipality won't enforce the zoning bylaw?
In essence, that's what it says, yes.
And how long has that been in the zoning bylaw?
I couldn't say, Ms. Dolch, do you?
I believe that provision came into effect in the May 28th, 1990 bylaw, so it's been in effect since then.
Since the beginning. And I presume there was some rationale for that. Do we know what that is?
I couldn't say, no.
Requirements, rather than just allowing it to go ahead in these minor yard violations. If you put it 0 meters from the property line, that you provide adequate setbacks and not impacting adjacent neighbors.
Mr. Lustig, have you had a chance to turn your mind to this?
Yes, I have. The intention here. Sorry. The intention here is to do away with something that is really unusual, which is to allow violations that are not protected by the principle of legal nonconforming use, but are simply violations that have been around for a long time. And so I think that that's the spirit of what's being suggested here, and frankly, I think it makes a lot of sense. What Ms. Dolch has just said is that there will be, however, some protection for those who have had the benefit over a period of greater than 10 years, which is a fair way of introducing this as a new part of the bylaw.
Right. This is a report for information purposes, so I'd be interested in knowing why this particular provision was adopted in 1990. And Mr. Lustig, maybe you can provide some background on that when this comes back before us. Mr. Kernahan, on slide 5 of your presentation, so the residential open space provision with respect to the balconies, is that to be 18.5 square meters to 10.5 square meters?
That's correct.
Okay. And one other question. No, that's it. Thank you very much. Is there anyone here who wishes to address council with respect to the proposed amendments to the zoning bylaw? There being none, I will declare this public meeting closed, and that takes us to the consent agenda. Are there any reports that anyone wishes removed from the consent agenda? If not, could I have a motion to, sorry, okay. Yeah, did you want the report removed, or you just want to ask questions? Sure. Okay, can we put this on the floor then? Would someone like to move it? Councillor Nutt. So the consent agenda items are on the floor for questions or comments. Councillor Butler.
Thank you. Yes, with respect to PDS 62-2017, through you, Your Worship, I'm just wondering if you could give me some information on, a few weeks ago, we talked about Grove Street and Ridgeway and having a number of feet of green to act as a buffer, and I just wondered, on page 6 of this report, there's a diagram, and I'm curious if it's heavily forested or if it's just shrub.
So Ms. Dolch, you have that schedule in front of you, or appendix?
Actually, Mr. Kovar's up at the front to answer that question.
Right.
Good evening.
Good
Through
evening,
you,
Mr. Corvin.
through you to the counselor. You're referring to Appendix 1 of the report, I understand? Your question was whether it's heavily forested. The property actually was cleared of trees recently by the developer, but the adjacent piece of land to the, I guess to the right of your page to the east, that's a town-owned piece of property for a future park.
That was dedicated by the owners, was it not?
Yes, it was, in connection with this development and the development to the south as their parkland dedication for both developments.
Thank you. I just liked where we were going when we were discussing Grove Street, and I thought that that might be something that we could take a look at moving forward as a community, but thanks. I appreciate the answer.
Are there any other questions with respect to any of the other reports? Ms. Dolch, we had a brief conversation just about the progress of these matters from here. So we've given draft approval for a number of these, and the recommendations on a number of these reports is that we approve the subdivision agreement once all the conditions have been met. And I think you've indicated that for most of these subdivision reports, they're very close to being approved. I'd asked a question about the site servicing pending approval from the Ministry of the Environment, and you gave me a response. I wonder if you could share that with other members of council and the public.
Sure, thank you, Your Worship. A while back, we heard from developers that we were delaying construction because we were waiting for MOE approvals before they could pre-service and start to service. We did legally look into that matter, and we were given some advice from legal counsel. And what that legal advice was that provided that they sign an indemnity to satisfy us that they would be responsible for all costs associated should the MOE not approve their application or have issues with some of their pipes. And if they install those pipes and they have to be removed, that it would be at their cost to remove all the servicing. And that's something that we've been allowing to happen since that time, that they could sign that indemnity. And the reason for that question from a number of developers was the length of time it takes to get MOE approvals. And sometimes they can take anywhere from 6 to 9 months to get those approvals in place.
But even if the services are in, without the approval from the Ministry of Environment, no houses can be hooked up to those service lines, I presume.
That is correct.
So this is just an opportunity for the developers to at least move forward while the review by the Ministry of the Environment is pending.
That's correct, and I can't see developers moving forward if they're still 6 to 9 months out. But if they, feel confident, like within the next couple months, they're going to receive that approval, they would go ahead with that pre-construction just to get them ahead of schedule.
And each of these reports provides for securities to be paid to the municipality, some of them quite large.
That's correct, to ensure that it's done in accordance with the approved plans and documents moving forward.
Right. With respect to the Peace Bridge Village Phase 1, is it, in order to gain access to that development, Louisa Street has to be opened to the south portion of that development, I presume?
That is correct.
And is that being opened all the way over to Arthur Street?
I would defer that to Jeremy if Mr. Kovar,
Jeremy?
if I could.
Yes, Mr. Corvar?
Yes, that Louisa Street will actually only go to where the road connection is, about halfway across that bold blue line in the first appendix there.
And that means that the only route in and the only route out will be from the top of this subdivision down, well, I guess Phase 1 isn't all to the top. But the only route in and out is Louisa Street, then to Antoinette Road or Jordan Drive.
There's actually a road access that will go out to Arthur. There is a town road allowance. On Appendix 1, it shows there's a narrow strip about almost halfway up. There will be a road that crosses there to Arthur Street, because the developer owns that larger piece that's between Arthur Street and the development.
So the strip that runs parallel to Louisa Street, which then hits a lot, you're saying is owned by the developer?
That's correct. So they will be
And-
building a road there.
And that will be part of Phase 1?
What they will be doing is they will build the road, because there's plans for a future development on the adjacent lands, which will utilize that road, so that at this point, they plan on building that road full curb and gutter. So that will be a final road, so they won't have to rip it up when they do Phase 2, which is a forthcoming application.
Right. So when construction is taking place for Phase 1, is the traffic going to be going through the neighborhood? Canada Drive, Louisa Street, and into the development, or will it be coming south from Arthur Street over the new road and then down?
It'd be through from Garrison Road down Arthur Street.
And we've required that.
That was not a special provision that was imposed, no, but that's our understanding from speaking with the developer, that will be the construction route.
Okay, so Mr. Walsh and Ms. Dolch, I think we should be looking at making sure that we're crystal clear on that, because I don't see a lot of construction vehicles going through that neighborhood. I don't think that would be prudent. Are there any other questions arising out of these reports? Councillor Luberts? Thank you,
Yes,
Mr. Corvar.
Thank you, Mayor Redekop. Just to follow up on what you were saying there, is Ms. Dolch and Mr. Welsh makes it quite clear, if that's the way it should be, should we not amend it so that it is clear in the agreement where we're going to use our entrance and exit?
I don't know, Mr. Lustig, is it necessary for us to amend the conditions of draft approval, or at this time?
I don't think so.
So we would simply utilize our powers of persuasion for the time being?
Yeah, so how do we enforce it?
Well, we've done that over in some other plans of subdivision. As an example, across the street, we've required the developer to come in off of Pettit onto Nathaniel in order not to go through the existing neighborhood. So they typically will work with us. I suppose if it becomes a problem. We've also done the same thing down in Ridgeway by the lake, Phase 3. We required the developer to come in from a certain direction. So if there's a problem, then I suppose we can always deal with it at that point. Any, Councillor Passero?
Thank you, Your Worship. I'm in agreement with that approach. I think if we were to make it a condition, it takes out the flexibility should something arise, and now they're not in compliance. So I'd appreciate just allowing staff to work with them, encourage, and should something arise, maybe they could let us know in the future if we need to go a different route.
Yep. Did you have anything further, Councillor Luberts? No? So I had one other question to staff with respect to the report IS 38 dealing with the St. John's Marsh Municipal Drain. There's a statement on page, there's a table on page 4 that continues on to 5, and a statement about the costs, and found it a little challenging to reconcile some of these numbers with the statement that the amount of contribution from private benefiting landowners, including the City of Port Colborne, City of Niagara Falls, Town of Fort Erie, will represent approximately 50% of the cost of construction, which I didn't quite follow. I'm wondering if, Mr. Walsh, I know that Mr. Maiden's not here, but I wonder if you could look at that and perhaps clarify that?
In this case, Mr. Mayor, all of the benefits are allocated towards municipally owned lands. So the private landowners, through the engineer's report, receive no benefit, so they are not assessed anything in this case.
Hence, that may explain then the statement that the favorable variance can be attributed to other municipal drainage works. Because my understanding is that only the cost of the drainage works were to be allocated against the landowners, benefiting landowners.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you. Does anyone else have any other questions with respect to the items in the consent agenda? If not, I'll call the question. All those in favor of the reports? None opposed? That is carried. That takes us then to Planning and Development Services. Councillor Passero.
Thank you, Your Worship. Planning and Development Services is in session. No presentations or delegations. First up is Report PDS 61-2018 concerning the amendment to Comprehensive Zoning Bylaw number 129-90 as a housekeeping amendment. Looking for someone to move that. Thank you, Councillor McDermott. That's now available for comments or questions. Seeing none, all in favor? That carries. Next up, PDS 65-2018 regarding proposed zoning bylaw amendment 2631, Windmill Point West Lane, David and Sheila Rich, Sean Sider as the agent. A mover for that report.
So moved.
Thank you, Your Worship. Comments or questions? Councillor Luberts?
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Just looking at the report, and at our last meeting when this year all came forward, I asked about the acquiring the beachfront lands, like we're supposed to be doing all along our lakefront during a zoning change. And under alternatives, it says that we could choose to defer the report until further details are known regarding the ownership, specific ownership. And then it goes on to say that this isn't recommended because it's been established who owns the beach. Well, I'm looking through the report and I see some comments about ownership, and it just says that exclusive use of the owners. And that's something that we haven't established. Who is the owner? Because my thinking is, if Mr. Rich is an owner, then what it is they're all collectively owners of that beach, that strip of beach. So we remove Mr. Rich's name and we insert the town of Fort Erie's name. Now we're part of the collective ownership. And I don't see anywhere in here where it gives specifics to ownership. I don't know if Mr. Rich is part owner of that strip. And if he is, that might change what we can do and how we can operate under the Planning Act with respect to acquiring beachfront. We might not own it all, but over time, each time there's a zoning amendment, then we get a piece, and sooner or later, the town of Fort Erie will replace everybody's name on that strip of land. But it's not in the report, and I'd like to know from staff, somebody can tell me specifically who owns the beachfront.
Councillor
Because
Luberts?
it's not established,
Yep.
as far as I'm
Let's-
concerned.
Let's start with Mr. Kernahan as the author of the report, just for an explanation or maybe clarification as to the paragraph under alternatives. Your Worship? Could you turn the mic on at the post?
The the parkland dedication bylaw, which provides us with a mechanism to take gratuitously beachfront or environmental protection lands as part of Planning Act applications, limits our ability to do that to the property which is subject to the zoning bylaw amendment. In this case, those beachfront lands whom you were requesting us to get some information on the ownership of, those are separate and distinct from this subject, the property which is subject to this application. So the nature of our recommendation or the alternatives to move forward with this, notwithstanding information on the specific ownership of that property, and I think if you look under the legal and legislative services comments, you'll find that there is some information on the ownership of that beachfront property. But nevertheless, the nature of our recommendation to move forward with this application, notwithstanding information on the specific ownership, is because notwithstanding who owns that beachfront property, it's separate and distinct from this subject application, so we don't have any ability to take it through our parkland dedication bylaw.
Councillor Luberts?
Yes, I understand exactly what you're saying. So what you're saying is all the people that are along that strip of beachfront, collectively, the people above the beach, they own the beach collectively.
So through you, Chair, to
Because
Councillor Luberts.
They must own it, right?
But through you, Chair, to Councillor Luberts, our legal and legislative services staff did some research into that. Perhaps they'd be better to comment on the specifics and how far we got on establishing who those people were that owned it. But I think.
But your lasting comment is these two properties are not inextricably linked as far as this report.
That's correct.
I would think, and I would probably be right, if I were to say that the property owners along that strip of beachfront are the ones that collectively own that beachfront. So I would say that they are linked.
I'm probably going to ask Mr. Lustig.
Yeah, I'm probably, but
Mr.
I
Lustig?
need that information, Mr. Lustig. I'm not seeing it. And that's what this report is
Councillor
about.
Luberts, let's let him answer first and then we'll go from there. Mr. Lustig?
Yes, so the strip is a separate piece of property. It's clearly a separate piece of property. It's pinned, meaning that it has an identification in the land registry system as a separate piece of property from any of the lots. So it's not part of any of the lots. It's separate. The ownership from our research of that strip, which is pinned separately and it's under registry, as opposed to land titles, which is the system that the lots are held under, most of the lots are held under, is owned commonly, as you put it, in common by all of the owners of the various lots, because at the time that the plan was registered earlier in the 20th century, the owner dedicated that strip of land to be used exclusively for the purpose of a promenade or a road to those owners in common. And so you've got two separate parcels of land, and Mr. Kernahan is absolutely correct in saying that the Planning Act doesn't give you an opportunity to take land other than land that is part of the application for the rezoning. This land, since it's a separately pinned piece of property, is not part of the application. You can't legally take it. As a side note, you can't really take land as a part of a rezoning anyways. You can take it for severances, you can take it for subdivisions, which are just larger severances, and you can take it for site plan control, which may be exercised in this rezoning or after this rezoning, because site plan control, I understand, includes single detached dwellings as well, which is a little unusual in Ontario, but in any case, it does. But the point is that the parcel that you're wanting to take would be a separate parcel from the land that is in the application for the rezoning, and you don't have the authority to do that.
Thank you, Mr. Lustig. Councillor Luberts?
Yes, thank you very much, and thank you, Mr. Lustig. Did I hear you say, Mr. Lustig, that under a planning or a zoning amendment application, we can't take the land away anyway?
You take it in most cases that a zoning application comes forward where land is dedicated, it's done by way of the site plan control process, which is allied to zoning, because in Fort Erie, virtually all of the zone categories are subject to site plan control. So the way you get it, essentially, if it is part of the lot, which is not the case here, would be through site plan control, strictly speaking, not through simply the rezoning exercise.
Councillor Luberts?
So what I'm seeing here is, I understand the idea of everybody collectively owning, and it's a separate piece of property, right? But that's the way it was laid out for the ownership, so the above lands are separately owned individually, and this beachfront land is owned collectively by all the same people. And that's what I'm saying is, when you make your zoning change, if we're going to be acquiring land that way, then we take Mr. Rich's name out and insert the town of Fort Erie. And I know what you're saying, and I understand that.
Councillor
But
Luberts, if
you're
that
sign-
was the
Mayor,
parcel that
I have
was
the
before us
floor,
tonight.
Mr. Chair. Thank you
Yes,
very much.
You have the floor for another 15 seconds, and then I'll go on
No,
to someone
I get
else.
5 minutes, and I don't see you timing. So thank you very much.
Councillor Luberts, one more question and answer,
Yeah.
then I'm going to see
So,
another
Mr.
member of
Ludstick-
council has a question.
Yes, well, you took away 2 of my minutes. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. So, Mr. Ludstick, I understand, but we have to establish if that's, I know you have 2 separate pieces of property, but it's owned by all the same people.
Mr. Lustig,
I don't know that
for
it
the
would be owned
purposes
by
of what we're
somebody
dealing with
down the
tonight,
road.
Mr.
So
Lustig.
I would have to, I would think that I'm going to look into this a little further myself, and I will probably be talking to lawyers, and it won't just be me doing it. I'll be talking to lawyers as well. But I find it very difficult to believe that we can take land away from one part of this town along the waterfront, and we can't take it away from the other parts of the waterfront. I find it difficult to believe that we can't do that.
Your worship.
Yeah, I asked the staff specifically to look into this because I was interested in this. And, you know, Mr. Lustig is an experienced lawyer, and the advice that he's given is accurate. And you're quite correct, Councillor Luberts. The single parcel owners own their separate parcel individually. They collectively own the beachfront promenade, and it's quite clear from the report the basis upon which they own that. It's no different than if you had a single parcel owner and an adjacent joint property situation where the adjacent owner and someone else were holders of the adjacent lot. The fact is, those are separate types of ownership in law. And what these property owners of the lots have is a right to occupation and use of that beach. They don't have ownership rights except as a collective. So whichever lawyer you go to will advise you of that. The staff has pulled some of the deeds, and the deeds show what the rights are of these individual property owners as far as use of that beach. I don't think it could be clearer. It's certainly clear to me, but then again, I have the benefit of a law degree. But it is clear, and your grasp is quite correct, Councillor Luberts. And the reason, as explained by Mr. Kernahan, that we can't request, even through a site plan process, a part of that beach is because the Riches don't own that beach themselves. They own it with a whole group of other people, and just putting the town of Fort Erie's name on the deed, I suppose that would be fine, but we definitely do not have the authority to take over an ownership interest in a parcel of land simply because someone's asked for a rezoning.
Thank you, Your worship.
No, well, thank you very much, Mayor Redekop, for
Councillor
your
Luberts,
explanation.
you don't have the floor back yet. Anything further, Your
This
worship?
is all, this,
No, I'm
he was explaining to me
No.
based on what I was asking, Mayor.
Okay,
Mayor?
let's just hold on a second. Councillor Passero, you are the chair, you're quite correct. You do not have the floor, Councillor Luberts. I'm finished. The chair now gets to decide who speaks next. Maybe a councillor who hasn't spoken yet may come back to you, I don't know, but please, let the chair manage the
Well,
floor.
Mayor Redekop, if I'm asking questions and then I get interrupted I get to continue with my question.
Okay, it's not, I don't think I can make it any clearer. You don't have the floor. Councilor Becerra has indicated you don't have the floor. He's the chair of this portion of the meeting.
Thank you. Are there any other members of council that have a question or comment before I go back to Councilor Luberts for the second time? Seeing none. Councilor Luberts.
Yes, thank you very much, Mayor Redikoff, for your explanation. And I'm glad that it's clear on how all of this here can happen. But I still, it doesn't matter that the fact is here, and it says in the report that we could defer this until we get the specific details. And Mayor Redikoff, like you said, you asked staff, and staff came to you and explained it to you. They looked into the matter and explained it to you. But I never got any of that explanation, and we didn't get that in this report. It says other owners, but it doesn't give us the specifics about ownership. But thank you very much for your explanation, and I'm glad that we didn't get the specifics. But I'm glad that we did do some clarification on how this all works. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councilor Luberts. One last call for questions. Your worship.
Just to point out that there is a section in the report that does deal with this, and it refers to what's in the deed of at least two of the parcels, including the Rich property, and indicated that they just didn't have the time to go through and check each and every parcel of land. And I think it's prudent that they didn't. I don't think we need to incur that cost because I believe it's clear. However, it's true, the staff does say that an alternative is to defer the report.
Anything further, Mayor Redikoff?
I've had enough.
Yes, me too. All those in favor of the report? Opposed? One opposed, that carries. Takes us to PDS 66-2018 concerning short-term rental regulatory licensing and enforcement strategy information report moved by Councilor Zanko. Comments or questions? Councilor Butler.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First, I'd like to thank Nicholas for putting this report together. It was really good, actually. I do have a couple of questions and a few comments. Through you, Mr. Chair, are we going to be discriminate with respect to locations for short-term rentals where they can and cannot operate from?
Ms. Dolch?
Through to the counselor, no, we weren't going to discriminate. It was going to be open to all homeowners in that regard. I know there was a question earlier I had with regard to single detached dwellings, and we did reference single detached dwellings in the report. And I know somebody did mention to me that sometimes these can be located in townhouses and things like that. We are going to have to put some thought to that, and I do apologize for making that term in the report, saying specifically single detached dwellings, but just so you know, it's not discriminatory in any way. It opens up.
Councilor Butler?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. No, I didn't mean it as a discriminatory way. I apologize. My wording is probably incorrect. What I wanted to do was make sure that we were going to be choosy with respect to where these can operate from. And, a lot of the constituents that I've been speaking with would not like to see it in residential neighborhoods, but rather in the traditional tourism spots, traditionally Crystal Beach and those kinds of areas. Sherkson, that kind of thing, right? Where people come down. But that's what I was wondering. The next question that I have is that the report does not address the number of occupants that can actually be with the short-term rentals. So if there's 2 bedrooms, does that mean that you're still going to allow 20 people, or realistically, on the safety side of things, is it 2 people per bedroom? Those kinds of things I think need to be addressed.
Let's start with Ms. Dolch and then see if the fire chief has anything to add to that. Ms. Dolch?
Thank you. Through to the counselor. We weren't planning any bedroom caps or occupancy caps. So what we looked at in particular was human rights for rental housing licensing. So it's under the Ontario Human Rights Commission. And they stress like 10 principles, and one is to avoid arbitrary caps. And they've indicated that why that is. They've indicated that unless you have a reason, if you permit, let's say, for example, single detached dwelling to have 5 bedrooms, it's permitted by law, to have 5 bedrooms. You've allowed a building permit. You can't discriminate once somebody tries to rent a house, because then you can discriminate in all sorts of fashions. So they're saying, if there's 5 bedrooms, you can still have people that can occupy those 5 bedrooms, and that's it. But I do want to defer to the fire chief, because we do have some abilities in a different fashion through the fire code for occupancies, and perhaps he can provide some more detail on that.
Thank you, Ms. Dolge. Chief?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The fire code under emergency planning discusses a whole list of areas where there may need to be a fire safety plan in place. And one of the line items in that is any time that there's greater than 10 people residing in the occupancy. So the fire safety plan would have to be reviewed by the fire department. It would dictate what fire suppression they have in place, what smoke alarms, et cetera. It would have to be posted within. The people that stayed there would have to be trained on what the fire safety plan is. And it has to be reviewed not only by the fire department initially, but annually by the individuals that have more than 10 residents. And then at that time, if there's any changes whatsoever, that has to be presented once again to the fire department for approval for the fire safety plan. It's no different than numerous occupancies that we have here. The only difference is it's for 10 individuals or more.
Thank you, Chief. Anything you wanted to add further to those comments, Ms. Dolge?
I would just specify that the licensing that's being proposed in this would include fire inspections, so that's something that the fire chief and his staff would look into.
Councillor Butler?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. So I just have a follow-up question with respect to the Human Rights Code, because we're looking, my express purpose at looking at this is the party houses, right? So, we don't mind people who are going to rent for 30, 60, 90 days, because traditionally they're there for a reason. But it's the party houses that are renting for less than 30 days that I'm concerned about. And so is there anything that prohibits then people from attending having more than 10 people there? Does it still fall under the Human Rights Code? I wouldn't think that it would.
Again, through you to the counselor, again, it's very, unfortunately, with this new phenomenon of short-term rentals, there's nothing. I did search the internet to see if the Ontario Human Rights Commission had anything new with regard to short-term rentals or Airbnbs or anything like that, but it's specific to rental housing licensing. Again, this is a report council asked for. There's changes you can make, but this is something we have to be cautious of, only because it is rental housing. No matter which form it may take, as you said, party houses or what have you, it's still a form of rental housing. And like I said, the issue is that there are requirements under the Ontario Human Rights Commission to avoid certain things, and one is the bedroom caps or occupancy caps. There are a number of them that, like I said, there's 10 of them that you should avoid. And I know when St. Catharines was looking at their student rental housing provision, they were given guidance to follow these rules specifically. So again, student rental housing has the same party atmosphere that people are concerned about.
Councillor Butler?
That makes sense, and I believe that they'd have a real big issue with parties. So I have a couple of more questions, if I may, Mr. Chair. First of all, I just wanted to let you know that I did like the report and the enforcement part of it. I just wanted to skip down to page 5 of the report with respect to the the cost of hiring someone. First of all, I'm wondering if we need to even include the fact that the planning department needs a 0.5 person, because in my opinion, you need actually a whole person. So I don't know if that's relevant to what we're asking here. You can explain.
Through you to the counselor. Yes, I do understand that that's a bit confusing, a 0.5 FTE for a full-time person, employee. The reason we did it that way is I wanted to give you a picture of the cost for short-term rentals. I'm not saying, as I indicated in the report, given the increased workload, planning staff is already short a half full-time employee, so that would pick up a full-time employee. Again, that extra half person would also be identified in budget for 2019 should this go ahead. But in terms of the cost of implementing the short-term rental, I wanted to give you a true cost rather than to throw an additional half FTE in there on you.
Thanks. So just looking at the numbers, and I was crunching some myself, the 17,600, I would think would be 35,200 if you're doing 200 by 176. That's the amount that I get. But nonetheless, I was thinking that fee on an annual basis is, I get it's for a bed and breakfast, but for short-term rentals, since they are making quite a bundle of cash, I am thinking that $500 on an annual basis to pay for a license is not unthinkable, and that would give you your $100,000 to absorb the fee for wages for the individual that you would be hiring for this. I'm looking at it from a perspective of if you're paying $80,000 in salaries, then your burden factor is going to be roughly about 23.34%. That covers all your remittances to the government and your EHT and WSIB and whatever else you factor in there, but that's about 19,000, so you're at 100,000. The training is probably a one-off, so it would be one-time fee, and then it would be not renewable on an annual basis. Would I be correct in that assumption?
Through you to the counselor, the training is an annual fee. It's 2% for the staff member to keep them current on the provisions that come out provincially and beyond. Also, if I can just clarify, the 176, it was a biannual. That's why it was 17,600, not annual. Again, that's something, again, you can look at, but just so you know, that's where it came from.
Do you have one more quick one you want to get in, Councillor Butler, before I give someone else a shot?
You can give someone else a shot, and I'll come back to it.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Zanko.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And through you to Ms. Dolch. The report is great. There's a lot of information shown on it, and I do appreciate the time that staff's put into it. I do have a number of concerns with the report. My main concern is I don't think that the ratepayer is going to want to pay close to $300,000 for enforcement. We have, some short-term rentals that are not following the rules. We don't have an abundance of them. Ms. Dolch, I believe Mr. Brady had said we have around 6 homes that we're having a real issue with right now. Is that correct?
Through you to the counselor, that's correct. We've had 6 complaints to date.
And I know that the 6 homes that we've been seeing the most complaints on, they are bringing in anywhere from $2,500 to $5,000 a week on these rentals. Some of them are hosting large events. They're posting advertisements that they can accommodate weddings. So again, the report touches on enforcement, but I think that it's very clear that this is all new waters for the majority of us, including staff. So my thoughts is, have we considered, and this isn't mentioned in the report, have we considered possibly hiring a consultant that is their expertise? I know that a number of municipalities must be going through this right now. Port Dover, Port Colborne, Niagara on the Lake, I believe, I know that they've implemented policy that has been not as foolproof as they were hoping it would be. But would we not maybe consider, rather than hiring staff and there are great options here, But again, at a price tag of $298,000, I have to say there must be another option for possibly consultant.
Councillor Zanko, what would you be looking for that consultant to provide us?
Well, I mean, in essence, I'd like to see how many short-term rentals we have, ownerships of these short-term rentals, on average what they're collecting. I think, you know, some heavier research, maybe if it's a month or two, that they spend collecting this type of data. And then I think essentially that would allow us to roll out some communications. You know, we can confirm what these homeowners are making. Maybe if we do have a permitting system, maybe it should be $1,500 a year if they're making $5,000 a week. I'm feeling like they could probably afford that, but just more specific data.
Ms. Dolch, comments to Councillor Zanko's inquiry?
Thank you. Through to the counselor. I just wanted to point out, and again, a lot of that information you're requesting would have to come from Airbnb directly. Even a consultant wouldn't have the ability to gain that information without going through Airbnb or VRBO or somebody to provide that information to us. In our first report, we did provide some information from 2017. And roughly with Airbnb, we have 100 in Fort Erie, just through that platform, though there are other platforms. And in 2017, they had over 5,200 guests staying in Airbnbs. The average host earns about $6,100 annually from renting out their property, with an average cost per night of $265. So that's the information that we received from Airbnb. And they do indicate that total Airbnb receipts in Fort Erie in 2017 were in excess of $500,000.
Ms. Dolch, related to Councillor Zanko's other comment, in your conversations with other municipalities, has that been their only option as well in gleaming this information? And
Through you to the counselor, yes, it has. They're the ones that manage the properties in terms of booking them out, renting. So you have to go through these platforms. I know in Vancouver, for example, they have, and even in Toronto, they have agreements with Airbnb to provide the tax information, like tax these individuals and collect tax payments for the accommodation. So you do have abilities, but you have to have agreements through Airbnb. And again, we've reached out to them just preliminarily at this point. And that's the information we have at this point. Again, there's agreements that you can look into for them to ensure that our licensing is adhered to. Things like that, we can work with those platforms. I can't commit that they would do any of those things, but.
thank you, Ms. Dolch. Councillor Zanko?
And thank you, Ms. Dolch. I really do appreciate that. I still am not convinced that Airbnb is the issue. I know that there's plenty of Airbnbs in Fort Erie. I know that the majority of them, you know, aren't having or advertising for large events, and, you know, housing 30 to 40 people in a 6-bedroom home. I think our real issue is the short-term rental properties. I understand Airbnb. I've looked into it myself. I know they have many guidelines. Their main rule is that if the Airbnb is causing neighbors disruption, they will revoke the Airbnb license. So I'm really not convinced that Airbnb is the issue. I think it's these short-term rentals that have very large properties close to the water, and they're advertising to host weddings. You know, again, in the report, there's nothing to exclude events. I know you had mentioned that the rental guidelines do not want to cap the number of people, but short-term rental and rentals are, in my mind, are just two different things. So again, I know this report is for informational purposes, and I really do appreciate the direction that we're going in. I think that there has to be something more that we can dive into a little bit to find out how we get our handle on this.
Thank you, Councillor Zanko. I just want to add, I just want to review the recommendations. So if this were to pass tonight, it is for information purposes, but we are also directing staff to initiate a very lengthy and time-consuming process. So we are receiving it, but also you're directing them to say, we like the information we're getting and keep on going. So if there's any angst amongst council that we don't want to go this direction, then we need to figure that out when everyone's had a chance speaking their mind. Councillor Nutt?
Thank you, Chair Passero. Just to comment on what Ms. Dolch said about the statistics from Airbnb, the City of Vancouver is also considering what they call an empty home tax, which they expect may generate in excess of $30 million. When I was doing some research on this stuff, my concern, like Councillor Zanko's, is that really Airbnb has a lot of strict policies to follow. And I don't really think that's where the problems are coming from. I've had a few complaints that I forwarded to Mr. Brady and Bylaw about houses in Ward 6 along the Niagara Parkway that are now have become what they call Hotel Fort Erie and rentals. So, in fact, I went there one night to visit a constituent at about 10 p.m. and there was, I'd say, in excess of 12 or 13, 14 people that I could clearly see at this. So next time I'll be calling the fire chief to come down and have a look. But my concern really is, how are we going to police the sites outside of Airbnb? And I think the only way to do that is with what's proposed in the report, which is additional enforcement. But again, like Councillor Butler, I would like to see the licensing fee that they make these positions a cost neutral. And one item that I didn't see in the report that maybe some feedback can be taken is, we need bylaw that works overnight. We need bylaw that works in those wee hours when these problems occur. Again, I went to the constituent who called me. I went to his property at 10 o'clock at night. It was the house right next door. And he had called me. His wife was just back from the hospital, and I just went next door myself, knocked on the door, and asked them to quiet down, which they did. But I think there's a real need to have that overnight enforcement, not just for this reason, but I know that some people in Ridgeway had a party house next door to them, and they had people uninvitedly jump the fence and jump in their pool, which to me would be, if that happened, say, at my parents' house or something like that, I would be really upset about it, because having a lot of retired elderly residents in the community, like, that would be something that would be very startling for them to happen at midnight, 1, 2 in the morning, to have some rowdy youngsters jump in pools. So I'd like just to see a little bit more about when that bylaw officer would be working, some designation, and to see some updates on the fee scheduling so that this becomes a cost-neutral position for the people of Fort Erie. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Nutt. Further comments or questions? Councillor Luberts, and then Mayor Redicom.
Yes, thank you very much. And just to follow up on what Councillor Nutt was saying, I think there was something in here, if I remember correctly, about hours of work.
There is. Speaks to overnight hours as well as from May through October.
And but anyway, I understand the concerns of the cost. We're looking at bringing in $17,600, and it's going to cost us $298,000 to implement the plan. And then we're receiving for information, but we're also giving direction to go ahead with what's in the report. So I would think that, can't we look at the alternative of working out the problems with the 6 problems that we have? Because like Councillor Zanko says, the Airbnb is not the problem. It's the name. We're attaching their name to the problem, but it's not the Airbnb. It's like anything else. It's the management of that Airbnb resident, right? And they're poor managers. And so I think that we need to bring something forward that shows, like Councillor Butler says, a $500 yearly fee for Airbnbs to operate in this town, right? That will slowly get rid of the ones that are giving us all the problems And then our demerit system, you know, revoking the Airbnb licensing, right? If we have a very strict demerit system where if you acquire them and you can acquire them fast, then you will be revoked. And we don't need a full-time employee to do that. We can do that, and let's see, just like it says in the report, what happens, and we'll monitor it and see if it's successful, that we get rid of the 6 that are a real problem. And then, you know, dealing with 1 or 2, that's a problem, we can work with that. But I don't know that we need to hire, because it says a half a full-time employee for planning, but then if you go to the next page, it's 1 full-time employee for bylaw. So is that 2 full-time employees?
No, the half is just letting us know that they're already short-staffed, so even if we give the 1 full-time, they're still going to be coming back at some point requesting that other half, just to give us a heads up as to what we're looking at budget-wise.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. So you're a half, you're short a half.
Yes.
And so you can't, well, you can hire part-time, but you'll end up with 1.5 employees. Is that what we're saying here?
If we bring planning to the full complement and we want to implement this, yes.
But I think that we should focus on trying to settle the problem with the 6 problems that we have. This year is overall the whole short-term rental system that's going on in this town. And I don't know, we don't have a problem with it other than these 6 that are, so I think staff should come back and give us more alternatives other than implementing the whole plan and doing it just to see if it works. And we monitor it because we all know ourselves, once we get a full-time employee, if it doesn't work, we just move that employee into a different part of the town and give them something else to do. So before we do any hiring, I think we should look at, let's work with the problem area and staff come back with another alternative to look at the problem area. Because it definitely is a problem in this town, but it's not all over. And it's a kind of unfair that Airbnb is getting the bad name here. And, but, you know, it's the people that are running them, that's the problem that we have, so.
Thank you, Councillor Luberts. Ms. Dolch, can you just clarify something for me? The 3rd paragraph under business licensing bylaw says that licenses, if we go this route, licenses will only be issued to the primary occupant of the dwelling proposed to be operated as a short-term rental. Can you clarify what that means? I think that might help reframe this discussion as far as this report and this process.
Thank you. Yes, the primary occupant. So what we looked at a number of examples in other districts, and one in particular, specifically Vancouver and some others, used this definition of primary resident, actually, indicating that they had to live in the home that they rented. They had to be the primary occupant of that home. Or primary residence. We changed the term to primary occupant in this case only because we do have a lot of American population or people that own second homes, but they still are those primary occupants of that home. So we defined it as primary occupant in this case. And that would allow those people that don't necessarily have this as their primary resident, but they are the primary occupant of that home. They live there at certain periods of the year, you know, solely on their own. This stops what we would classify as more of a commercial type operation where it's just a home that somebody purchases. They never live there. They just run it as a short-term rental through an Airbnb platform or VRBO platform or a room key. There's so many of them, but and that's why we defined it this way, because we're associating this with home occupations, which is a permitted use, permitted commercial use for dwellings, and we wanted to associate the two together. Once you start to get away from the primary occupant of that dwelling, you get more into the nature of a commercial operation, versus like a sole commercial, not a home occupation type commercial occupation.
And Ms. Dolch, if I could, is this process that's laid out in this report is that solely hinged on that premise of the primary occupants, or can it be workable if we do go the other route?
What we've put together for you through the licensing would just be for the primary occupant.
Okay. Your worship.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
And then Councillor McDermott.
Yeah, I've got a lot of discomfort with respect to this report. I feel that we've got a problem. We know that we've got a problem. We just haven't yet been able to clearly define exactly what the problem is, and until we clearly define that, I don't think we can come up with a solution. The notion that we would spend $300,000 a year to get in some elaborate licensing program that is going to solve a problem, I don't know if it's our problem, I just don't think that that's palatable. It certainly isn't palatable for me. I've had a chance to chat with Ms. Dolch and give her some of my concerns. I don't think, as an example, we should be immediately eliminating the notion that we can place some type of zoning so that some of this can take place in some areas, but not in other areas. I don't think we should throw that out quite yet. I think that's something that we should keep open until such time as the public's had a chance to comment. The type of dwelling that we're talking about, why couldn't it be a townhouse? Townhouses are available for use for this type of short-term rental all over the world. I've been in them in Belfast as an example, and very well run, very well organized. We were very quiet. We didn't disrupt our neighbors. That, of course, is the biggest issue. So I'm wondering whether it should simply be detached dwellings, and I think Ms. Dolch addressed that. It could be broader, depending on where the area is. In terms of the demerit point notion, if we get into that type of licensing, I think it has to be simply very clear, very strict, and very regulated. And so as an example, you get to so many points, you're given a warning that the next time you get to the next level, your license would be revoked, if we go that route. And then I think maybe a committee to hear an appeal, fine. But I don't think it should be overburdensome, and I don't think it should be very wishy-washy. I think it should be very clear. In terms of the charge, yes, we have a lot of small-time operators in terms of renting out their properties, maybe 3 or 4 times a year. And then we've got some big-time operators that are actually running a hotel, as Council has mentioned. Some municipalities tax that. They tax the revenues. We'd have to get into a whole new level of regulation with respect to that. But, maybe that's a possibility. I don't know. And we could work through Airbnb, and I don't think Airbnb is getting a bad name here. I mean, I'm hearing councillors say that they're quite happy with Airbnb, which does seem to have some type of handle on who it is that uses their overall service. But they charge a fee. Why wouldn't we be charging a fee? And what's our ability to do that? In terms of the limitation on the numbers of occupants, I think that there is a distinction, as Councillor Zanko has pointed out, between rental and short-term rental. This isn't, we're not talking about renting homes to people as their primary dwelling place. We're talking about people that are coming in and leaving, like a hotel. Hotels can limit the number of people that occupy a unit. Motels can limit the number of people that can occupy a unit. These are for the short period of time that they have people in them on a rental. These are like motels, really. So I think that there's a lot of information that we still need to get from staff. There have been a lot of good ideas and a lot of requests for further information that have been raised by councillors. I would think that it would be appropriate to separate these 3 recommendations. As an example, I'd be in favor of 1. I wouldn't want to go to 2 until we get some more information and perhaps some other alternatives, as has been suggested. And then when we get that information, then we could go to the public and get some feedback from the public. In the meantime, there's absolutely no reason why we can't be enforcing some of our bylaws. There's absolutely no reason why we can't have bylaw enforcement working some Saturday evening shifts, because that's apparently when much of this would happen, Friday, Saturday nights. And that's a matter for the CAO, or the acting CAO, to take under advisement, because we have the ability to direct our bylaw enforcement people, particularly if we right now know that we've got some specific locations where there could be problem. So that's what I'm thinking right now. I'm not feeling as discomforted now that I've had a chance to speak, but that's how I think we should move forward with this. Thank you.
Thank you, Worship. And you're correct. We have in the past utilized bylaw overnight specifically for winter control operations, but we've made that shift over to our road supervisor and other designates to free up bylaws. So there are some creative things we can do to make sure we get enforcement out there. Councillor McDermott.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you to Ms. Dolch, these 6 that we have that give us all the trouble, are they owner occupants? Do we know that?
Ms. Dolch?
Through you to the counselor, I can't confirm that at this point. I could get back to you on that. I'd have to check with bylaw enforcement on the owners. I don't get into those details.
Well, I'd be interested in knowing that, because, I mean, if they're advertising and getting hundreds of people to come up to their places, they're running a commercial operation out of their house, aren't they not?
Ms. Dolch?
Again, it's a single detached dwelling. That's the use of it. In terms of who's renting it and all that becomes a little unclear. And again, right now, we don't have those definitions to help us. A hotel, for example, is defined as something registered under the Hotel Registry Act, which none of them are, so they don't meet that definition. Do they meet the definition of a dwelling unit, a single detached? But yes, they do. But the use of them is kind of fuddled things in terms of their clear use for renting purposes. But again, it's very gray, unfortunately. There's no clear, and that's why we're, with what you requested in terms of licensing enforcement, we also included a piece on zoning, only because we wanted to clear that up. If you do have a short-term rental, let's define it. Let's say that you have to be the primary occupant. So in order to provide some enforcement mechanisms as we move forward.
Councillor McDermott?
Well, all I know is that I had a couple of residents that lived on the boulevard and were paying estate taxes and had homes to them. They weren't Airbnbs, but they were short-term rentals. And the next thing you know, after a couple of complaints, their houses go up for sale because they don't pay big taxes to be annoyed by 100 or so people next door. But I agree that, I agree on 2 things, and one is that I think Airbnb should be licensed by the municipality, and their place is checked out by the fire department. But what really concerns me is that we have 6, just 6, and we can't handle this. We have to find a way of shutting the operations down when they become a nuisance to their residents. So, it's, if I was living next door to a place that was having big parties of 120 every weekend, I think I'd consider putting a for sale sign up on my house. So I think what we have to do is do this in a prudent manner financially. It's going to not drain the bank, and I don't think by adding another employee is going to do it, but 6 people cause the problem, and all of a sudden it's a huge problem, right? So I think what we have to do is limit our scope to solving the problem of the 6, because that's never going to change unless we do something. And then make sure that every one of the Airbnbs that are going to operate in this town are safe, and I'm sure most of them are. But I think that we should license them here. I think we should have them checked out, because all the hotels are checked on a regular basis, and we take care of these six groups here that don't really care if bylaws or noise bylaws or actually criminal bylaws in some cases are not followed. I think we should be looking at that. That's all.
Thank you, Councillor. I just want to clarify with regards to the six. So we've had 6 properties where formal complaints have come in to planning staff. There could be many more out there because we hear all the time. We all receive several phone calls from people who say, hey, this has happened 20 times. And I say, well, what did you do the first 19 times? Well, we didn't say anything. So it could be more than 6, and we need to wrap our minds around developing some type of framework or regulatory process or enforcement actions, because these 6 could easily next summer turn to 25. So we can't just go from a perspective that we only have the 6. We need a framework. This is a growing industry. We've already been caught flat-footed, as has every other municipality. So we can't go with the mindset that we've got 6, let's deal with those 6, and everybody's going to be happy. So I just want to put that out there for everybody to consider. I've got, I'm going to go in reverse order. Everybody has spoke, so I'm going to go back. Councillor Butler, did you have anything further? Okay, Councillor Butler. So we'll go around second time. Councillor Butler.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. I really like what everybody has to say, and I just wanted to touch base on what Councillor Nutt had said about the one resident. They're located on the Dominion, and the house that they've been complaining about, the owner is a consortium that owns 75 homes. So in that instance, that it's a business. It's not just to offset the cost of a house that they want to be able to afford and live in later. It's something bigger than that. And I think that when you look at situations like that, it becomes a bigger problem in our community, because when we're dealing with affordable homes, it jacks up the prices, and it makes it makes homes less affordable and available to those that actually need it. So the problem is bigger. And then on the flip side, I just wanted to mention as well, I do like the mayor's suggestion with dealing with the first one, and obviously public consultation is needed. But I did want to bring up that while we're looking at it from the neighbor's perspective, where they're being inconvenienced, there have actually been problems with people renting the location and telling those neighbors, again, going back to the Dominion Road as an example, those renters walk into massive piles of garbage that have been stored in the garage, massive flies that come out, maggots, those kinds of things. So it's not just a situation for the neighbors, it's also a situation for the renters. And I think controls really do need to be put in place. I think ultimately we have to be responsible too.
Thank you, Councillor Butler. Councillor Zanko.
Thank you. I just wanted to talk about the one point in the report that refers to the additional bylaw part-time officer for, I believe it, I'm looking for it right now, I can't find it, but I'm sure it said from Friday to Monday, 9 p.m. to 7 a.m. I actually think that that's really important. I think that we should, I'm hopeful that maybe staff can consider that, or I'm prepared to move that for next season, because I think one of the major issues is residents either contact the NRP and they're busy doing many other things that take precedence, or some residents just aren't comfortable contacting the NRP. They feel it's more of a nuisance, and they want to reach out to the town and our bylaw enforcement, but we don't have an officer available. So I think that for next season, I'm hopeful for May, whether we consider it during budget allocations, or as Councillor Passero had mentioned, we have had additional bylaw staff that have been moved around to other areas. But I do feel that that's definitely needed for next season. And I also agree with my colleagues. I would be prepared to move the first that of this report forward this evening as well.
Okay, thanks. Thank you, Councillor Zanko. And we will deal with those separately. Councillor Nutt, I'm just going in order of the first time around.
Thank you, Chair Passero. Just a few other comments. This issue isn't unique to Fort Erie, as Thorold and St. Catharines have had massive issues. And I can tell you for a fact, being close to the real estate and mortgage industry, there's huge speculation in large consortiums that do own massive amounts of property in those cities. So it's not a problem that's unique to Fort Erie. If we've only had 6 formal complaints, I kind of consider that a blessing that we haven't had more, but I agree with Councillor Butler. Like, this needs to be addressed. How do we get a handle on it? How do we, give the people that we represent peace of mind, the full-time residents, that we're going to look out for the best interests of the town? It's not just the problem of the noise. It's like Councillor Butler brought up. It's the garbage. It's the property standards that are going to occur. And I think we're underserved in the bylaw department. So I think that's a much needed head count, and I think it should be given serious deliberation at budget time, not just to address this issue. We have a lot of issues that we're always hearing about, how many open files there are and how stuff's not getting dealt with, and how bylaw doesn't have the time to come back and follow up with dates and times that they're supposed to, and things linger and fester for a long time with residents, and it's just it's a situation where we're clearly understaffed. So again, I don't think it's a problem that's unique, and like you said, Chair Passero, that we were caught flat-footed. I think everybody was caught flat-footed. It's a rising industry, but we still need to have the mindset that we have to take care of our residents here. And I just think that, licensing out the short-term rentals, I'm in agreement with the mayor. I think that we have to have very strict rules that they have to abide by, and I'm okay with doing this in piecemeal and moving that, and if that's the appetite we have as a council, I'm okay with that. There's still plenty of time to deal with all 3 of those ads.
Thank you, Councillor Nutt. I agree. Noise, parking, garbage, and property standards are not just tied to short-term rentals. They're issues we face all the time, and it's whether it's a short-term rental of 20 people or a full-time owner of 2. There's no discrepancy as to when you encounter those issues, but it does seem like moving towards more money in bylaw, which leads to greater enforcement at the hours when the issues are actually happening, and we can catch some of these things happening and hit them in the pocketbook. These people are out to make a profit, so if you can make it undesirable in that sense, they either shape up or they ship out. Councillor Luberts, I have you next on the list.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Just going back on some of the things that Mayor Redekop was talking about as far as the report goes, and I'm looking at the overall report. What's in front of us tonight, and I'd like to deal with it, but I'm in the same position I think that everybody else is. It's a lot to digest, and I don't know that any of us are ready to digest this. So I'm looking around and maybe asking the clerk for some assistance on how we can amend this so that we continue with the dialogue as to how we're going to attack this problem, right? Because I think that if we looked at the report right the way it is, we'd have to vote against it because we're not happy with the way it's laid out. And I would myself. But I don't want the issue to die on the vine as well. So let's talk about how we're going to amend the motion and still keep the dialogue going. And I think to start, I'd like to amend that we remove the second that.
Okay, Councillor Luberts, I'm going to ask the clerk for assistance. What I would prefer to do, if the clerk tells me it's okay, is just go through each recommendation separately. So we'll start with the first, we can defeat the second, we can defeat the third, and we can also make an amendment to include additional information from staff.
We gotta, because it definitely has to be amended.
Yep.
We gotta vote on it.
Yep.
And we gotta get something, because we need to discuss this over the winter months.
Yes.
And hopefully we can have something in place for spring.
Okay. Prior to us doing that, I do just want to give the courtesy to His Worship and Councillor McDermott if they'd like to speak a second
Well, I'll
time.
withdraw my motion, and
Okay.
then let's all work together and get something on paper so that we can continue to move forward.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Luberts. Your Worship.
My preference would be that we pass number 1, that we defer number 2 to obtain further information and alternatives from staff, that we defer number 3 until such time as we receive that additional information and alternatives from staff, and that we amend this by adding a fourth, which is that we direct staff to address the need for bylaw enforcement at variable hours in the interim. That's how I would see this playing out, because I think that's what we're all talking about. And then
Yep.
we keep moving the matter forward. If the deferral might be for a month or whatever staff thinks they might need in order to come back with alternatives and respond to the issues that we've raised.
Your worship, and also Madam Clerk, can we do a deferral on just an individual recommendation, or should we just attach a timeline to that individual recommendation? I know we're going to deal with them each separately, but can you defer just a singular recommendation?
I believe you could do it either way. I'm
Okay.
rather thinking that the second one that you proposed might be cleaner, to leave the recommendation as is with the deferral time,
Okay.
rather than actually postponing it.
Okay,
Just put a date in.
okay. So, Your worship, I will come back to you right after Councilor McDermott, if
Yep.
that's okay. Councilor McDermott.
Okay, I just wanted to point out that I know there's more than 6. There are 6 reported, I got that. But
I
one
know
thi-
you're only worried about the 6 in Ward 1. It's okay.
No, I just wanted to say, though, is that I would like to see something specifically how we deal with the problem of the 6, because it's a common occurrence. And I know that one of the reasons that this older lady on the boulevard had when she moved was because she was having anywhere from 100 to 200 visitors to this house every weekend. And I think we have to be a lot more compassionate to the ones that are living in that community. And the only way we can do that is by laying the hammer down on folks who do this. That's my only comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor McDermott. So I'm going to go back to his worship to put forward those amendments. So, Your worship.
Yes, thank you. So I would move that we deal with these separately, and I would suggest that we move the first that we defer the second that to whatever time frame the staff deems appropriate, so that we can get further information from staff and other alternatives. That we defer the third that until we've received that information from staff, and that we amend the recommendations by adding a fourth paragraph, that staff be directed to address the need for bylaw enforcement at variable hours regarding short-term rentals.
Okay. So I'm just looking for a consensus of nodding heads. Okay, so let's go with the first one. The recommendation is that council receives for information purposes report number PDS 66-2018 regarding the council request for the creation of a short-term rental regulatory, licensing, and enforcement framework for consideration. All in favor? Okay, that's carried. And then secondly, Your worship, is to, I guess, amend this by including a deferral date. So, Ms. Dolch, what would you recommend?
I was just looking at the calendar. Oh, thank you, Carol. So I would probably recommend in November if possible. I understand it won't be before the election, but just to give us some time, just for us to reach out to some, especially the Ontario Human Rights Commission, things like that, given the questions you raised regarding area zoning and limit, just to see if there's some options there. We didn't have time to contact them directly, but that would be something we could look into a little further.
Is November specific enough, Madam Clerk, or would you prefer a date?
It'd be a date.
November 13th.
November 13th, okay, thank you. So that's, amendment is on the floor from his worship for the second recommendation. Comments or questions?
November the 12th, a holiday?
Remembrance Day. Okay, all in favor? So that's carried. So we'll go back down to the third recommendation as it stands right now, that council directs staff to consult with the public on the proposed draft amendments and report back to council. So I'm guessing we would want to do that pending receipt of the additional staff report.
We would defer that until we've received the additional information.
Okay, all those in favor? That's carried. And Your worship, if you could just one more time read your additional recommendation.
Yes, that staff be directed to address the need for bylaw enforcement at variable hours regarding short-term rentals.
Your worship, just based on the conversation, do you want to make it specific to short-term rentals, or do you want to leave it a little bit more open-ended based on some of the comments?
I'd be happy to leave it open-ended, just to deal, but I think if we do that, I think we need, I'm sure that staff has been listening, and they understand that our focus for the time being, although it won't be likely in another couple of months. So yeah, I'd be happy to leave out the short-term rentals aspect and just confine it to staff be directed to address the need for bylaw enforcement at variable hours.
Okay. Everybody is comfortable with that? Ms. Dolch looks hesitant. No, you're good. And Mr. Walsh was waving frantically. Mr. Walsh?
Mr. Chair, it wasn't frantically, but I was going to comment on the
It was
specific
frantically
term.
for you, Mr. Walsh.
Yeah, if we could just leave that open and not specifically for short-term rentals, I think there is a demonstrated need to have after-hours bylaw enforcement for a matter of it, or a number of issues. So as the current motion stands, we're good with that.
Okay, Ms. Dolch?
I did just want to clarify, we do have one staff member in bylaw enforcement on variable hours, but it's for parking,
Yes.
and that was her purpose, to be hired for parking. So shifting some of that may affect some parking enforcement if that's the case.
If no additional resources were allocated, which could
Correct.
be an alternative brought forward.
Correct.
Okay. Counselor Luberts and then Counselor Zanko on this new amendment put forward by His Worship.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'd like to just ask a question on the last amendment with the public consultation. I didn't get a chance to ask any questions
Yeah,
on that.
no, sure, go ahead.
All right. I'm just wondering, we deferred it, the public consultation, but since we're here and this has all been exposed to the public, would we allow the public to email in any suggestions or requests or anything at this time?
Oh,
And
absolutely.
then we'll have the public consultation actually take place later?
Yeah, this,
But we still accept,
absolutely. Yeah,
So
this
could
is
we-
just, this is
could
just
we-
referring to formal consultation regarding what we're actually proposing to do, which we don't really know yet.
yeah, I just want the public to know that while we're waiting, they can still send in some requests or some suggestions as to how we could move this forward.
Absolutely.
Okay, so, all right, okay.
Thank you, Counselor Luberts. Counselor Zanko.
Thank you. My question is just in reference to the variable hours of bylaw enforcement. I know Ms. Dolch had mentioned that we do have bylaw enforcement working variable hours currently, but I would actually prefer to see the hours very specific to weekends and after hours. I don't think we have bylaw enforcement from the hours of 11 p.m. to 4 a.m., which it seems to me that that's when the most nuisance is caused. I think that would help a great deal while we're figuring this all out for the next season. So if we were to look at the report, the recommendation in the report, I know it was Friday to Monday, I think it was 9 p.m. to 7 a.m. I don't know, Your Worship, if you wanted to be more specific with the hours.
I'm thinking that we should leave this to staff. They've heard what we've had to
Okay.
say. I think it's pretty clear that they're going to have to be available when it's most likely that offenses will occur. I mean, I don't know that things happen Sunday night.
Yeah.
Probably Friday, Saturday for sure, and certainly in the areas that have already been identified, and there may be some other areas. I think I would prefer to leave it to the staff to address this based on the comments that we've all been making.
Okay.
I would just add, Counselor Zanko, that the information in this report was only being viewed through the context of the short-term rentals, which is why the May through October and the Friday through Sunday. But if we give that leeway to staff, we may look at saying, 2 nights a week, we probably should have somebody just going around for general noise complaints or parking infractions. Okay? Thank you, Counselor Zanko. I'm just going to go back one more time. Anybody else, another comment or question before I go back to Counselor Luberts? No? Counselor Luberts. I'm sorry, I wasn't really going back to you because you had a comment on the previous one, but the floor is yours.
Yeah, just going to this latest one that's out there, the looking at what we have now as far as our bylaw, are we saying that we're looking for variable hours with the current complement, or are we looking for variable hours for another employee? And I'm saying that because if we're thinking that we're going to need another bylaw in town, maybe we can add that we direct staff to bring that forward in next year's budget for a full-time employee for a bylaw, because I called bylaw today, and one of our officers is off for a couple of weeks. So now we have one person doing all of bylaw in the town, and that's going to be difficult for him, and there's going to be people getting frustrated over the next 2 weeks because, you know, it's going to take longer and longer for things to be addressed. So
I believe our intent is for staff to look at the overall bylaw picture, whether we meld this position into different hours or whether we need additional staff, but I'll defer to his worship to get his mindset on what he's proposing.
Yeah, I'm quite confident that the staff, that the CAO is looking at the need for additional bylaw enforcement resources. And I would expect that if this amendment passes, that will simply confirm that there likely is a need for additional bylaw enforcement resources. So that will be part, I'm confident, of the 2019 budget presentation.
okay, thank you very much. I just wanted to clarify that we're looking at adding addition, and right now, for the time being, we'll just look for variable hours.
Thank you, Councillor Luberts. So I will put the report up for a vote as amended. So we've approved, added a time, and added an amendment. Oh, that's right. So we have to put the amendment on the floor for a vote. So last call for comments or questions. Seeing none, all those in favor of his worship's amendments? That's carried. So now the report as amended. All in favor?
Madam, or
Yep.
Mr. Chair, do we have to read out the amended? I think we made that agreement months ago that
If you'd like me
after
to.
the amendment, we would read out the new proposed.
Sure. So we have the first recommendation stands, basically that we're receiving this for information purposes. The second recommendation is that we are deferring that until November 13th. The third recommendation would stand, but that would be post-November 13th, once we receive the information back, and I'll defer to his worship for the wording of his amendment.
Right, that staff be directed to address the need for bylaw enforcement at variable hours.
Okay, so that's what we're dealing with. All in favor? That's carried. Brings us to new business or inquiries under Planning and Development Services. Seeing none, comments or questions regarding the business status report? Seeing none, I will gladly turn the chair back to his worship.
Thank you very much, Councillor Pissarro. Well done. That takes us to infrastructure services. Councillor Zanko.
Thank you, Your Worship. We have no presentations or delegations this evening. We don't have any reports. We do have a new business inquiry. Councillor Nutt.
Thank you. Not really new business. I just wanted to follow up on an inquiry that I made last month with regards to getting the road cleaned at the corner of Ridgemont and Bowen Road. There's a lot of loose gravel that's in the roadway there, and I've had some individuals who ride motorcycles who had contacted me because it presents a danger to the motorcycles to have that much gravel in the road. So I'd like to make a formal request that we send the street sweeper down there and clean that intersection as best we can.
Mr. Walsh?
Through you, Madam Chair, when the original request came through about a month ago, I took a drive out there, and at that time it was clear. It's obviously collected more debris again. We'll phone Walkers again, and I know they have a street sweeper they send around. We'll get them to clean it as it's out of their quarry, rather than us incurring the costs.
Yeah, I just would like to comment through you, Madam Chair, that when Mr. Walsh did go out there, Walker's was good about cleaning the road, including the part where all the soil and sediment was gathering along the right-hand side. and you are correct, Mr. Walsh, they did go out and do it, but since then, it's gotten a little bit worse again, and people that were, because Bike Fest was this past weekend, so we had a lot of motorcycles that were heading to Welland and whatnot, a lot of people leaving Ridgeway, Fort Erie, and heading out through Stevensville to Netherby Road, and I got a few calls just in regards to that with people on motorcycles saying, you know, hey, I was fine, but this really does present a danger, and I know you did an excellent job following up on it last time. I'm hoping you can get some action from walkers again. Thank you.
Anything further? Councillor Luberts?
Yes, thank you very much, Madam Chair. Through you to Mr. Walsh. On the corner of Glen Spring and Westwood, I was at a constituent's house there the other day, and they were talking about right in the corner, right in the middle of the intersection, basically, there's a sinkhole starting. And it's getting to be big enough now where when they're driving, you can't see it. And when you're driving, you hit it, it's like your front end's gonna come out. And I went there, and I didn't see it at first. I had to actually get out of my car and walk on the road to see it. Everything is intact. The stone and chip and everything is intact. But there's a big bell, like a big dip in the road, just like a little sinkhole. Maybe there's a pipe underneath that's broken and the debris is falling in the pipe. And I'm wondering if you can send someone down there and have a look and see what we can do to repair it. But it would be right in where your left wheel would go if you were traveling south.
Yes,
Mr. Walsh?
we will, Madam Chair.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Anything further, Councillor Luberts? Does any other member of council have any inquiries? Seeing none, is there any, Councillor Nutt?
Sorry, yes, Madam Chair, I apologize. I did forget one item, and I have it written down here in my notes. I was just asked to pass along to Mr. Walsh the thanks of some residents that had called and had contacted regarding tree removal, that Mr. Hutton had followed up and in a very short turnaround time had addressed a couple of tree situations with the arborist and everything, and they had asked me to pass along their thanks on the quick response.
Noted, thank you.
Are there any other items? Seeing none, does any member of council have any questions regarding the business status report? Seeing none, I will hand the chair back to you, Your Worship.
Thank you very much, Councillor Zanko, and that takes us to Corporate and Community Services, Councillor Nutt.
Thank you, Your Worship. Corporate and Community Services is open. Presentations and delegations, there are none tonight, so we'll move right into report CAO 11-2018. Can I have a mover? Moved by Councillor McDermott. Just as a follow-up, the mayor had declared a conflict on this one with the Crystal Ridge Community Center lease renewal. That report is on the floor. Comments or questions? Councillor Passero.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just through you to, I guess, Mr. Walsh. Probably not Mr. Walsh. Who's tackling this one? Mr. Lustig? Anybody? I'm just wondering, last time we had Mr. Bruins here doing a delegation, and there were a couple of items that we were not seeing eye to eye on with staff. I'm just wondering, are there any outstanding items where there is a clear line between what Crystal Ridge has been requesting and what we have been able to offer them?
I can respond to that. My understanding is that we are now completely in agreement. That is, the two parties are completely in agreement. This represents the final version of an agreement that's been discussed and revised, but it indicates that both parties are in agreement with all of the terms.
Okay. I had assumed that because I had run into Mr. Bruins yesterday at a golf tournament, and he didn't take the opportunity to bring me aside. But I just wanted to make clear that that's where we stand right now. So I've looked at it, I've read the terms. It's very consistent with our other capital asset facilities in town that we lease out to other groups. I'm happy with how the cost sharing is proceeding. I think that's fair towards both parties, and I'll be fully supporting this tonight. Thank you, Mr.
Thank you,
Chair.
Councillor Passero. Are there any other comments or questions? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All those in favor? None opposed, that carries. Moving on to 10.3, new business inquiries. Does anyone have any new business or inquiries? Seeing none, I'll move on to the business status report. Are there any comments or questions regarding the business status report? Seeing none, I'll close corporate and community services and pass the chair back to His Worship.
Thank you, Councillor Nutt. Very efficient. That takes us to scheduling of meetings, and Councillor McDermott, I don't know how I could possibly not have in my calendar this Saturday's big event.
I don't know either, Your Worship.
It's because it goes all day, and I have other things on the go, but
You're probably right.
please make the announcement.
Well, on September 22nd, Bridgeburg District BIA would like to invite all of Fort Erie and people throughout Niagara to come to the Taste of Fort Erie. This is to be held on Jarvis Street. There's over 100 vendors, lots of food, probably the best entertainment in Niagara. And it's a family-oriented event with the kids zone and a special kids stage. So we have entertainment for everyone. And we'd like to see 5,000 or 6,000 of our friends on Jarvis Street on Saturday. Stephen Pissarro is the counselor of weather, and he tells me that we're going to have a great day. So if it rains, we're going to blame him. Thank you.
Are there any other meetings that anyone wishes to advise us of? Councillor Pissarro.
Thank you, Your Worship. Tomorrow morning, Museum Services Committee, 10 a.m. here at Town Hall, Conference Room number 1. Thank you.
Thank you. Any others? If not, Councillor Nutt, I'm going to you for the motion to adjourn.
Thank you, Your Worship. The Council and Committee for the Town of Fort Erie hereby adjourns at 7:55 p.m.
All those in favor? None opposed, that is carried. Thank you.